Though the men of the Seven Kingdoms might call them children of the forest, Leaf and her people were far from childlike. Little wise men of the forest would have been closer. They were small compared to men, as a wolf is smaller than a dire wolf. That does not mean it is a pup. They had nut-brown skin, dappled like a deer's with paler spots, and large ears that could hear things no man could hear. Their eyes were big too, great golden cat's eyes that could see down passages where a boy's eyes saw only blackness. Their hands had only 3 fingers, and a thumb, with sharp black claws instead of nails. And they did sing. They sang in the true tongue, so Bran could not understand the words, but their voices were pure as the winter air. "Where are the rest of you?" Bran asked Leaf once. "Gone. Down into the earth," she answered. "Into stones, into trees. Before the first men came, all this land that you call Westeros was home to us. Yet even in those days we were few. The gods gave us long lives, but not great numbers, lest we overrun the world as deer will overrun the woods when there are no wolves to hunt them. That was the dawn of days, when our sun was rising. Now it sinks, and this is our long dwindling. The giants are almost gone as well, they who were our bane and our brothers. The great lions of the western hills have been slain, the unicorns are all but gone, the mammoths down to a few hundred. The dire wolves will outlast us all, but their time will come as well. In the world men have made, there is no room for them, or us." Kind of a shorter video here today, but I wanted to make this video after having some conversations about whether or not the Children of the Forest and the Crannog men were able to interbreed, and if our modern Crannog men hero characters actually have a little Children of the Forest DNA in their veins. Now, I'm firmly on the fence against this idea, largely because I don't think we see enough in-text supporting evidence to imply this, and I actually think that some of our stories and tales that might seem like evidence can actually weigh against this idea when examined more closely. But also, if you examine Martin's previous writings, the idea that people can breed with creatures that are non-human, or that they can have children with non-human humanoids, is actually something he's careful to write against in his works. This is from Dying of the Light. When Dirk happened to mention his year on Prometheus, Janet quickly seized on it. "Tell me, Talarin," he said, "do you consider the altered men human?" "Of course," Dirk said. "They are. Settled by the Earth Imperials way back during the war, the modern Prometheans are only the descendants of the old Ecological Warfare Corps." "In truth," Janek said. "Yet, I would disagree with your conclusion. They have manipulated their own genes to such a degree where they've lost the right to call themselves men at all, in my opinion. Dragonfly men, undersea men, men who breathe poison, men who see in the dark like Haroon, men with 4 arms, hermaphrodites, soldiers without stomachs, breeding sows without sentience. These creatures are not men, or not men, more precisely." "No," Dirk said. "I've heard the term not man. It's common parlance on lots of worlds, but it means human stock that's been mutated so it can no longer interbreed with the basic. The Prometheans have been careful to avoid that. The leaders, they're fairly normal themselves, you know. Only minor alterations for longevity and such. Well, the leaders regularly swoop down on Rhiannon and this rock raiding. You know, for ordinary Earth normal humans. Yet even Earth is less than Earth normal these past few centuries," Janek interrupted. Then he shrugged. "I should not break in, should I? Old Earth is too far away in any event. We only hear century-old rumors. Continue." "I've made my point," Dirk said. "The altered men are still humans, even the low castes, the most grotesque, the failed experiments discarded by the surgeons. All of them can interbreed. That's why they sterilize them. They're afraid of offspring." So what this means is that George R. R. Martin's worlds are a little bit different than what we've come to think about in some other versions of sci-fi and fantasy from games and books and television. And this is a topic that's been around in sci-fi for quite some time, the idea of can humans breed with aliens, non-human humanoids. And I know that Westerosi creatures like the Children of the Forest and the Giants aren't aliens. Well, at least probably not. And so I might make the comparison to the groups of great apes and how great ape species can't generally interbreed. Like, for example, you can't have a half-human, half-chimpanzee or half-human, half-orangutan hybrid. Even though these share a lot of similar characteristics, at least as much characteristic overlap as, say, giants and Children of the Forest, or humans and Children of the Forest. Okay, random internet guy. So, George R. R. Martin doesn't like to let his different kinds of humanoids make babies. What does that mean about the children of the forest and the Crannog men? Well, fundamentally, it means they are two separate species, and cannot interbreed. So, where is this idea coming from then, if there's no real good evidence that the children of the forest are interbreeding with anybody, and if it doesn't really make a lot of sense in the way Martin constructs his worlds? Well, it comes from a handful of places, so let's go over a few of those right now, and I'll talk about each one and why I think it's not necessarily the best evidence that there is any cross-species breeding going on here. Maester Lewin crouched beside Bran's seat to whisper counsel in his ear.
You must greet these ones warmly. I had not thought to see them here, but you know who they are.
Bran nodded.
Crannogmen, from the Neck?
Howland Reed was a great friend of your father, Sir Roderick told him. These two are his, it would seem. As the newcomers walked the length of the hall, Bran saw that one was indeed a girl, though he would never have been able to know it by her dress. She wore lambskin breeches, soft with long use, and a sleeveless jerkin armored in bronze scales. Though near Rob's age, she was slim as a boy, with long brown hair knotted behind her head and only the barest suggestion of breasts. A woven net hung limp from one hip, a long bronze knife from the other. Under her arm she carried an old iron great helm spotted with rust. A frog spear and round leather shield were strapped to her back. Her brother was 7 years younger and bore no weapons. All his garb was green, even to the leather of his boots. And when he came closer, Bran saw his eyes were the color of moss, though his teeth looked as white as anyone else's. Both Reeds were slight of build, slender as swords and scarcely taller than Bran himself. They went to one knee before the dais. He tried to recall all that he had been taught of the Crannog men who dwelt amongst the bogs of the Neck and seldom left their wetlands. They were a poor folk, fishers and frog hunters, who lived in houses of thatch and woven reeds on floating islands hidden in the depths of the swamp. It was said that they were a cowardly people who fought with poisoned weapons and preferred to hide from their foes rather than face them in open battle. And yet Howland Reed had been one of his father's staunchest companions during the war for Robert's crown before Bran was born. So, as you can see, the Crannog men are described as extremely small in stature, and are described using some of the same terminology used to describe the children of the forest. This later description of Meera Reed further reinforces this. Meera Reed was 16, a woman grown, but she stood no higher than her brother. All the Crannog men are small, she told Bran once when he asked her why she wasn't taller. Now I know what you might be thinking. Well, that size similarity is pretty shocking. However, focusing on the size similarity sets aside all the other vast differences between the children of the forest and human beings, including the fact that they have very differently structured hands and feet, and drastically different facial features, including very large and prominent ears apparently. There's an ocean of differences between the children of the forest and the average human being. And the same is certainly true of giants. In old Nan's stories, giants were outsized men who lived in colossal castles, fought with huge swords, and walked in boots a boy could hide in. These were something else, more bear-like than human, and as woolly as the mammoths they rode. Seated, it was hard to say how big they truly were. 10 feet tall maybe, or 12, Jon thought. Maybe 14, but no taller. Their sloping chests might have passed for those of men, but their arms hung down too far, and their lower torsos looked half again as wide as their upper. Their legs were shorter than their arms, but very thick, and they wore no boots at all. Their feet were broad, splayed things, hard and horny and black. Neckless, their huge heads thrust forward from between their shoulder blades, and their faces were squashed and brutal. Rats' eyes, no larger than beads, were almost lost within folds of horny flesh, but they snuffled constantly, smelling as much as they saw. They're not wearing skins, Jon realized. That's hair. Shaggy pelts covered their bodies, thick below the waist, sparser above. The stink that came off them was choking, but perhaps that was the mammoths. And Jormungand blew the horn of winter and woke giants from the earth. He looked for the giant swords 10 feet long, but saw only clubs. They were just the limbs of dead trees, some still trailing shattered branches. A few had stone balls lashed to the end to make colossal mauls. The song never says that the horn can put them back to sleep. One of the giants coming up on them looked older than the rest. His pelt was gray, streaked with white, and the mammoth he rode, larger than any of the others, was gray and white as well. Tormund shouted something up to him as he passed, harsh clanging of words in a tongue that Jon could not comprehend. The giant's lips split apart to reveal a mouthful of huge, square teeth. and made a sound half belch and half rumble. After a moment, John realized he was laughing. The mammoth turned its massive head to regard the two of them briefly, one tusk passing over the top of John's head as the beast lumbered by, leaving huge footprints in the soft mud and fresh snow along the river. The giant shouted down something in the same coarse tongue that Tormund had used. So again, we're coming across some pretty irreconcilable differences if we're assuming that these two very disparate creatures were ever able to actually breed. And I think the vast physiological differences should offset observations like the fact that Hodor is large, or that Mira is small. So what about the argument that because the children of the forest have green sight, they must be the original progenitors of green sight, and therefore other people like human beings must have bred with them in order to get green sight? Well, this kind of presupposes that the children of the forest are the only creatures that could have green sight. It's quite possible that green seeing is a thing that occurs in many animals and we just don't know about it. Moreover, it's possible for there to have been a common proto-humanoid ancestor that had the original green sight that developed into many different groups that now can't interbreed, which would both explain why the children of the forest have green sight and why people have green sight, while simultaneously explaining why they are different species that cannot make children. So I think in the end there's lots of explanations that better solve this issue than to assume that the children of the forest and the Crannog people were breeding together. I mean, the idea that they were even living that close together to me is somewhat suspect, because it would seem as though the Crannog men were displacing the children of the forest from the Crannogs. Okay, so all that aside, I do think there's actually another kind of more in-world reason why people in the universe of the Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire might be thinking this or proliferating this legend. And that kind of comes down to in-universe prejudice. So the Freys are pretty big on otherizing the Crannog men and making them seem less than human, and this is to justify their kind of perpetual conflict with them, that they never seem to be winning. And thus the Freys come off really bigoted towards the Crannog men.
Who's hungry?
She asked, holding up her catch. 2 small silvery trout and 6 fat green frogs.
I am,
said Bran, but not for frogs. Back at Winterfell, before all the bad things had happened, the Walders used to say that eating frogs would turn your teeth green and make moss grow under your arms. The Lady Mira of House Reed, the rotund guardsman bellowed over the clamor, with her brother, Jojen of Greywater Watch. Men looked up from their cups and trenchers to eye the newcomers. Bran heard little Walder mutter, "Frog-eaters," to big Walder beside him. Sir Roderick climbed to his feet. "Be welcome, friends, and share this harvest with us." Serving men hurried to lengthen the table on the dais, fetching trestles and chairs.
Who are they?
Rickon asked. "Mudmen," answered little Walder disdainfully. "They're thieves and cravens, and they have green teeth from eating frogs." So what I think these examples demonstrate is there's kind of this, myth built up around the Crannog men proliferated by the Frey bigotry. And I think that myth probably both spills over and or is fed into by this whole Children of the Forest belief thing. Mira Reed's ability to breathe mud and such is seen both as a positive benefit by her brother and as a gross, dirty Crannog thing by the Freys. And breathing mud itself seems to just be a metaphor for an ability to live and survive in the bogs, something the Freys don't understand how to do and have always judged and looked down on the Crannog men for.
The gods give many gifts, Bran. My sister is a hunter. It is given to her to run swiftly, and stand so still she seems to vanish. She has sharp ears, keen eyes, a steady hand with net and spear. She can breathe mud and fly through trees.
So this idea that Crannog men being close to nature makes them somehow close to Children of the Forest, makes them somehow less than human, or potentially opens up the idea that they're partly not human, I think is tied in heavily to this kind of in-world mytholization of the Crannog men and the bigotry towards them. Anyhow, I think you kind of get what I'm going at here in this video, so I'm going to play one more interesting clip that I think highlights what I'm talking about here, in a fun and interesting way.
Frog-eaters don't smell like men,
Frey insisted.
They have a boggy stink, like frogs in trees and scummy water. Moss grows under their arms in place of hair, and they can live with nothing to eat but mud and breathe swamp water.
Theon was about to tell him what he ought to do with his wet nurse's fable when Maester Luwin spoke up.
The histories say the Crannog men grew close to the children of the forest, in the days when the Greenseers tried to bring the hammers of the water down upon the neck.
It may be they have secret knowledge. Suddenly the wood seemed a deal darker than it had a moment before, as if a cloud had passed before the sun. It was one thing to have some fool boy spouting folly, but maesters were supposed to be wise. When the woods began to darken, Theon Greyjoy knew he was beaten. Either the Crannog men did know some magic of the Children of the Forest, or Osha had deceived him with some wildling trick. And so I think we're going to have to leave it with that for right now. So leave your comments and objections below. I'm trying to get out more videos, so hopefully there'll be some new content soon. And with that, thank you for watching, everybody, and I will see you next time.